Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's panel hosted by Malayalis for Black Lives Matter. MBLM's focus is on allyship with the Black community through anti-racism action and education. And a topic that has come up regularly in discussion is the need to include all Black lives when saying that Black Lives Matter. Unfortunately, there are many voices that are erased from the narrative or ignored, and that includes the voices of Black queer folk. However, to be able to effectively ally ourselves with Black queer folk, we need to provide support and allyship to the members of our own Malayali community who are queer. As stated by Blue at Indigenous Pride LA 2020, invisibility is a type of oppression through little or no recognition. For example, one of the best ways to oppress a people is to ignore them. Don't see them in a room, don't talk about them, and don't have them talk. The panel today is to make those of us who have been cast into the shadows, those of us who have been forced to hide or pretend we don't exist, visible. My name is Justina Yohannan. I am a queer/bisexual cis woman of Malayali descent. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I will be your moderator today. However, my role will be slightly different from the typical moderator role. Rather, I'll be facilitating and engaging in this conversation on what it has been like to be a queer person in a racially marginalized group in the Western world. And there will be a specific focus on sexuality, as gender identity requires its own separate panel to do the subject matter justice and to avoid conflating the two. So a little bit about me. I have a PhD in school psychology. I decided to pursue psychology because I grew up feeling very isolated, and I didn't want other kids to grow up feeling the same way. And so I kind of just fell into that world because it kind of just suited the work I wanted to do. And as someone who has always identified as a helper, it was a really good role and a good fit for me. I specifically work with kids who have been exposed to various types of trauma. I do a lot of treatment work. And when I first joined my psychology program, my focus was also on, at the time, what was called multiculturalism, and it slowly evolved into social justice, because the term multiculturalism was not enough to address these systems levels of oppression that were affecting the kids that we work with. And to be quite honest, in our program, we didn't have as much social justice work, so I ended up doing extracurricular work via dialogues, so doing race-based dialogues and gender-based dialogues to be able to build those skills to be able to address social justice-related issues. And that's kind of where I'm at now. I found that I really found a lot of healing in myself by doing this helping work for others. And part of my hope for today's panel is to find, again, healing for myself while also providing potential healing for others. So that's about me. Could y'all please introduce yourselves so that our audience can get to know you?
Absolutely. So I'll go first. Justina, as you were introducing yourself, I realized so much of our bios kind of overlap because we were in the same program together and did a lot of our work together. So my name is Adrianna Crossing. I am a Black woman. I identify as queer or bisexual, and I am cisgender. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am participating in this panel today because it's a cause that I care a lot about, as far as like elevating Black voices and establishing allies in other communities of color, particularly Asian communities, because I feel like there isn't a lot of communication overlap and sort of connection there. And so when Justina asked me if I would participate in this, it was a no-brainer. So I'm really happy to be here with you all today to sort of shed light on the experience of Black queer folk, as well as sort of draw parallels, connections, and understanding between Malayali queer folk and Black queer folk. So a little bit about me. I grew up in the South, and now I live in the Midwest. So those of you who are US based could probably get how that's been a lot of a culture shift. And that's particularly meaningful because my Blackness is viewed differently where I am now, as well as my queerness, I think. So what I do now is I'm currently a school psychology PhD student. I am currently in my 5th year in the same program that Justina just graduated from. And my journey to psychology, sort of the helping type of psychology that we do, the like health service psychology, it's actually a little circuitous. I used to want to be a researcher, and then I participated in some research where I worked directly with kids, and the rest is history. I just found my calling there, found my passion, and particularly the school I worked in was like completely kids of color. It was super low income, super rural, and I learned that there aren't a lot of mental health professionals in schools like that. And so I found my way to this field because I wanted to help fill that gap. The types of things that I look at are racial stress and trauma experiences for children in Black families. I also think about social justice training in psychology as a field broadly, and also how we support our minoritized students. And so that includes race, sexuality, ability, and socioeconomic status. There are definitely tons of, oh, and first generation status. There's a ton of other ways in which graduate students are diverse, but those are the ones that I have focused on. And then like Justina said, I also became a dialogue facilitator because I felt like there wasn't a lot of opportunity to build up skills talking about race, talking about gender in a way that heals as opposed to divides, just through sort of the built-in programming of my graduate program. And so I feel like what brought me to this type of work, panels and talking about these things, is more my dialogue work than my psychology work. So that's me. Oh, I'm also mom to a dog. I know that's not relevant, but it's such a core part of my identity. She's my little bean. Anyway, who's next? Nice to meet you all.
Oh, that was fabulous, Adrianna and Justina. I feel so honored to be here and so precious to listen to your stories and to your bio. My name is Sid Mohandas. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am calling in from London, UK. I'm a queer person who grew up in Kerala, India. I'm currently doing my doctorate here in London at the Middlesex University, where I'm investigating how gender materializes in early childhood spaces using feminist, post-human and new materialist theories. And I'm just excited to be here and look forward to what will emerge in our conversation.
Hello, everyone. I am Askari Rushing. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am super, super excited to be a part of this conversation because I think oftentimes queer people of color get erased in the LGBTQIA narrative in the US. Often it seems very whitewashed, and a lot of times our race or ethnicity seems to take precedent when we're interacting with others. So I'm really glad to have this conversation, especially across ethnic groups. I work in athletic academics. I recently took a job at Mississippi State University, but athletics is my passion. I'll be moving back to University of Michigan, where I got my master's in higher ed with a focus in social justice and diversity, to work with the Rackham Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Certificate Program. A lot of my start started when I studied abroad in Spain. So my background is in accounting and Spanish. And you're probably wondering, how did I go from accounting to social justice? Not a very clear link there. I will admit, accounting has never been my passion. But when I studied abroad, I first got to understand that for once, my Black identity, which had been such a major part of who I was and how I developed in the US, took a strong backseat to my US passport. I really wanted to understand, what was that intersectionality like? Why is it that when I'm overseas, me having American citizenship was what people focused on, even though I looked like many of my kinfolk, people that came from Africa? Like, why was it that all of a sudden I was safe or acceptable to be around, whereas people who looked just like me but didn't have a US passport were cast with suspicion, and a lot of times they faced a lot of violence in the countries I was visiting? So that's kind of what brought me to this work. I'm really excited to be here, and I am so excited to hear what my colleagues have to say, and I hope that this panel can be really informative for everyone watching.
Thank you all for those wonderful introductions. So our first question is, could you please describe to me your journey with gender and sexuality?
I'll start. Again, let's just like I did with the introduction. My journey, I think, is like a lot similar to a lot of bisexual women in that I thought I was straight for a really long time. And it's funny because the kids around me in elementary and middle school kind of clocked me, well, a good decade before I clocked myself. It was so confusing because, you know, I grew up in a highly Christian upbringing, grew up in the church, and so there was never any discussion of sexuality. This is pre-2013-14, y'all, so it wasn't like legal, you know, to be gay. I love the US. Anyway, and I always admired women. That's what I called it. It was admiration, or she's so pretty, or she's so athletic, or I just want to be like her. And, you know, as I got older, I realized that that was not universal, like all women, I didn't feel that way about. And so as I sort of entered my early 20s, I fell in love with a woman for the first time. And that was very confusing for me. And there was a lot of sort of grief and confusion and self-hatred and internalized homophobia. And just, I was so lost. And sort of slowly figured out that that was okay. And I actually bought the book Sexual Fluidity. I can't remember who wrote it, but it was really instrumental in my understanding myself, which is that, at least from this one author's perspective, the way that women sort of move through their sexuality can be more fluid. And that could be true of everyone, but this book was focused on women. And so I read that book when I was like 22 or 23, and I started coming out to people. I thought, this is me. I love for the person, for the spirit, for the soul, for their energy, for their personality, and I fall in love with whoever. And so that was sort of my journey, and I love this part of myself now. I accept this part of myself. I enjoy building connections with other queer women and other queer folk, and it's a community that I'm so glad I now, because I love myself and accept myself, now have access to. So that's how I got to where I'm at today.
That sounds so liberating, Adrianna. And I mean, like you, I guess unlike you, I had an awareness of it from a very young age. The earliest memory I have is when I was 4. And as a 4-year-old, I remember having feelings for other boys. I did not have the language or the understanding of what I was experiencing. But later on, with time, I realized that what I was not acceptable in the society. And so I spent most of my childhood and adult life trying to change myself to be normal, AKA straight. And it was actually seeing and experiencing connections that normalized and celebrated queerness that, that took me into this journey to find liberty, like you, Adrianna, in being who I am. So that was my journey in short. What about you, Askari?
I can actually kind of connect to parts from both of y'all's stories. So like Adrianna, when I was a kid, people were calling me gay since I was like 7, but I was just really into Pokemon, so I had no idea what being gay was. I was like, but I just want to catch Pikachu, like 151, gotta get them all. But since similar to you, I never really, when I was around 12, I never really had the idea of like, oh, I'm supposed to like girls. I just was like, I am attracted to boys. Like, that's who I am. But growing up in the church, I felt that was just wrong. So I never talked about it, but I was really lucky that in high school, I actually went to an all boys high school. I actually had friends who were really supportive, and also my friend group tended to be also really queer, which I feel like happens a lot to queer youth. As they get older, they find out, oh, you are also queer, but we've been friends for 5 years. Why do we not know this about each other? But I think I was so scared because I went to school in Alabama, which for all those in the US, they know Alabama is a very conservative state. I actually met Adrianna in college. That's kind of how we know each other. And I used bisexuality as a way to feel like there was still something that was right about me because I could still be attracted to women. But bisexuality is very different, its own unique, very specific sexual identity that is valid and means everything and should not be erased from the LGBTQI+ umbrella. It is very important, and it's very different being either homosexual or lesbian. So I just want to establish that like bisexuality is not a road to homosexuality. Bisexuality is its own separate identity. And it took a long time for me to be comfortable with that. But even as I was saying I was gay, I was like, something just doesn't feel right about this because I never really experienced sexual attraction specifically. And then it was about maybe 4 years ago that I came around the idea of asexuality and gray sexuality. And so asexuality is a lack of sexual interest in other people, regardless of gender. And then gray sexual is like asexuality, but it means you experience sexual attraction on a scale. And so it tends to be very limited. I realize that's kind of what I'm most identified with. And so usually I just say I'm gay because it's easier for people to understand. But because we're having this conversation, I want to say like asexual is how I really do identify. It took a long time, and so I'm really actually thankful for TikTok and a lot of Gen Zers because I don't know what it is about the past 8 months of like quarantine, the pandemic, where people have really been putting a lot of content out there, and I've been learning so much about my own sexual identity from people who are feeling more free to express themselves now.
I absolutely love that. I love that all three stories so far have had like a liberation type of phase. For me, when I was growing up, sexuality was very much a binary. It was either you were gay, you were straight, there was nothing in between. And I knew fairly young that I was attracted to men, boys, I guess, since I was young. But that I was aware of. And so I never bothered to look deeper. It never occurred to me to look deeper. And by the time it would have started occurring to me was when I was around like teenage years. And like Adrianna kind of mentioned, the messaging was so conflicting, and there was so much internalized homophobia because of both American society and also what I was hearing from like the Malayali Christian society, that I heard things like, oh, I kind of like what Adrianna said again, I appreciate a woman's beauty, but I'm not attracted to her. And I went, that's got to be it. That's what's happening with me. And it wasn't until later that it occurred to me like, oh no, that's not what's happening with me at all. What they say when they say appreciate is very different from what I'm seeing. And so it took a long time for me to sort of reconcile that with myself. The first time I truly started to acknowledge that I was not straight was when I was in my early 20s, and I literally got tipsy with my cousin, and I was just like, you know, sometimes I wonder if I'm bisexual, but if I reject that because of internalized homophobia. And my cousin just went, are you? And I was like, no. So that went spectacularly well. It's, again, that internalized homophobia is so deep, and it takes a lot to dig yourself out of it. And at that time, I was struggling with other things about my own identity outside of my sexuality, and I just didn't want to be another type of other. I wanted to belong. And so by the time I finally accepted it was when I met my current partner, who is a cis man, but he provided me a space where I felt comfortable to explore that aspect of myself. And it was wonderful because, like you all said, it's liberating to be able to say, yes, this is who I am. Yes, I happen to be attracted to people regardless of gender. And that doesn't change fundamentally who I am as a person. So it sounds like all of us heard quite a bit growing up that queerness in some capacity was wrong. And I'm curious about where specifically you heard that, what kind of messaging you got.
I can start this time. A lot of it definitely came from the church. It's interesting. My mom is very Baptist, which is like a denomination of like Lutheranism and the part that came from Martin Luther. But my dad is atheist. And so it was always that idea of like, I'm going to the church. I'm hearing all this. But at home, my dad is very accepting, but I still haven't actually come out to my parents yet, even though I'm out to all my friends, coworkers, and my personal life outside of the home. But I also think a lot of it came from TV. I'm going back and watching a lot of early 2000s TV that was definitely inappropriate, and I should not have been watching, like The Parkers and Girlfriends and 101. If you know these shows, there's a trend. They're all Black shows that came out in the early to mid 2000s. And the language there is very transphobic, very homophobic. There's like a fear of seeing like the predatory gay guy, or women who might identify as lesbian being seen as sexual gratification, sexual objects for men. And so I think a lot of that messaging was really retained at 7, 8. I don't know what I was doing watching these shows at 7 and 8. I was a very precocious child, apparently. And so I think I internalized a lot of that. And then there was that whole movement in the US about like, you shouldn't say that's so gay because gay is an insult. But for the first 10, 15, 17 years of life, gay was an insult. And then going to an all-guys school, the F slur was used all the time. And so I think just in my daily life, I was picking that up, and then it was being reinforced by something that my mom believed so strongly in that I thought this has to be wrong.
Mine is very similar to Askari as well. In my circle, I grew up in Kerala, as I said, and I remember hearing people say things like in Malayalam, "Oh, avan ada, mateda," which basically translates as he's that thing. So there was a sense of disgust that circulated that was so immense that even to utter the word gay seemed to evoke feelings of repulse. The thing is, my parents knew from a very young age that I was queer, gay, but my sister actually caught me looking at pornographic images of naked men online on the internet when I was 11. And I think she told my mom about it, and my mom took me aside and she tried to explain to me that what I was engaging in was something bad and sinful called gay. So that was the first time I heard that word being, you know, used in a negative way. And but until then, you know, I was deeply aware that you know, that what I was did not fit into the society and it wasn't acceptable. One of the things that I feel that you know, that seems to surface quite a bit was around the same time, we also had embraced Christianity. We were basically Hindus, the Irava community in Hinduism, which is a particular sect. But having diagnosed with cancer, we, at the age of 10, it led our family to convert to Christianity as a way of seeking ways to find a way out of my cancer. So Christianity really, you know, like in your case, Askari, really had a huge impact and inflected the way that I saw myself and how I carried myself. And I was quite a Christian fundamentalist where I went about trying to convert people as well. So by the time I got to university, I was sharing Christianity in the campus and sharing the gospel in the campus. And there were students who were Hindu nationalists who were really upset and angry with me for doing it. And I remember one time the student who was a Hindu nationalist sent an email to the entire department. And he said that I was gay and that that everyone in the men's hostel needed to be aware of me and, you know, needed to be careful when they were around me that I would like do something to them or something like that. And so for weeks and weeks, I hid myself in my, you know, room in the hostel and would go to the canteen by evenings. But then, even then, you know, there were people around who would call out names and insult. And one of the common things that I recently came to, you know, recollect was that they did this certain style of clapping. I'm not sure if Justina, you're aware of it. It's the clap that the Hijra community in India do. Hijras are the third gender community in India. And that it's a very particular style of dance, which kind of goes like that, you know, forward. And so when they used to see me, they'd immediately start, you know, doing this clap, signing that I was, you know, which actually happens as a result of conflation of gay identities and the Hijra sort of identity. So yeah, so that was a very difficult time of my years in university, and it really, yeah, shaped some of my experiences. How about you, Adrianna?
Sid, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I'm sure that recollecting that and recalling it might be difficult, and it really moved me. And just thank you. Gosh, it was so powerful. I kind of forgot the question. Oh, right. What influences shaped? So for me, you know, as Askari was sharing his story, and it reminded me of some of my early sort of like school experiences, as well as my family's own messaging. So I don't think that I grew up in the church enough, and by that I mean I don't think I attended enough actual Sunday services to sort of say I grew up in the church, but I do still identify that way because it was a big part of my childhood. But the way, so there were two people in my life, adult men, who I knew were gay because my parents told me. And I remember the moments where they told me to this day, and I don't have a huge grasp on my childhood memory, so that's very meaningful because they said it with such like gravitas and weight as though it were a bad thing or a thing to be a secret, a thing to be hidden. It was, okay, we need to tell you something that you don't know about, this family member. They're gay, and what that means is, and so it felt heavy, it felt secret, it felt wrong the way it was communicated, and I don't think that's what my parents intended. I think that was very much in line with the way the culture was talking about homosexuality at the time. But one thing that I really struggled with was the other one was like a friend of a parent's that used to come around and help us around the house and personal training with my mom, and he tutored me in science. He was a doctor, and I just remember the day that my mom told me he was gay was the last day I ever saw him. And so I thought, and he just never came back to the house. And he was around like at least twice per month for almost a year of my childhood. And so there was, in my mind, I put this connection between learning this person was gay and him disappearing as I was young, and kiddos, I say kiddos, sorry, kids, that's my school psychology coming out, children, sometimes make links in their head that aren't logical as they try to make sense of the world. And so I think that I paired the fact that this man disappeared with me learning he was gay as, this negative, this association that was very strong in my heart and in my head. And another unique thing about sort of my upbringing and the messaging I got was my younger brother is 5 years younger than me. And as soon as he turned about 4, he showed some interest in women's clothing and dolls and things like that. Now he designs fashion. So we kind of got there. He's straight, but he just really likes designing women's fashion. He's out in California doing that. But I always heard my mom say, it's okay if you're gay. We just want you to know that we will love you, no matter what, and that it's okay, and it's okay. And so when I went talked to my mom about my confusion around my sexuality in college, I never thought that I would get pushback because I had heard her telling my younger brother that it was okay to be gay. So I didn't realize that in her mind, she just meant the G in LGBTQI2S plus, what have you. And so when I tried to say, Mom, what if I like someone I'm not supposed to like, is what I said. And she guessed who it was. And then, later on, she came up to my room and she said, bisexuality doesn't exist. It is, it's unacceptable. And, you were raised Christian. And so I want you to think of this as something that you need to pray about and reflect on and try to heal from. And, I have sort of turned away from the church at this point in my life. And there was this encouragement to turn back to the church to try to figure out how to heal from this affliction. And I think that really set me back on my path to accepting myself by at least 2 or 3 years. And my mom knows she's actually the last person in my family that I did come out to because that conversation was so hard. And so for me, it wasn't so much experiences in the church or at school, but messaging I got within my family unit that was influenced by our Southern heritage, right? Like my parents are from Tennessee and Kentucky. I grew up in Georgia, and then sort of everybody grew up with missionary Baptist upbringing. And so I think that the messages and values of that particular denomination of Christianity and just Southern culture in general really influenced the way that my immediate family unit communicated about sexuality.
I think what's interesting is that it's not just like the explicit that has kind of shaped how we grew up thinking about queerness, but it was also that more quieter side of things, or that lack of, like, for example, representation, or when you did see representation, it was completely a stereotype. And for the longest time, for example, like, lesbians always died in movies and in TV. There was never a happy ending. And so, like, when you're younger, you associate that, and you're just like, oh, if you are a woman who loves women, you're gonna end up either unhappy or dead. And that's terrifying, like absolutely terrifying. So you have those media representations, or lack thereof. You have, in my personal experience, you have the church, which when I was younger, I went to a Malayali Orthodox church, and it wasn't as explicitly said there, like on the altar or anything like that. It was never in homilies, none of those things. But you would hear like some side stuff, like after the mass, said by people in the church, and you were like, okay, can't do that. Don't want to be too much one way or the other. Like, you just hear these messages from people who think they're saying things just offhandedly. But you deeply internalize that when you're young because that's all you know about queerness. And then when I was in my teens, we moved to the Catholic church, a Malayali Catholic church. And there it was so much more explicit. Like, our youth group once had a speaker come in who was incredibly transphobic. And I spent the entire time just like clenching the table, being like, don't pull a Jesus, don't flip this table, don't do it. Stay calm. Because I was furious. But there's that power differential there too with the church where it's like, I can't say anything because it's just not appropriate. And also there's this heavy tie to like, if you say something, if you are open about these things, your family will be shamed. And one of the things that, the only thing I was really anxious about when doing this panel was how my family is going to be treated after this. Because I don't know how it is in the Black community, but with Malayalis, people can be mean. People can be like real mean. And so I have a genuine worry that people are going to say crappy things to my parents about like, oh, you raised her this way, when I was born this way, number one. And people can't seem to wrap their heads around that. But two, the only way they raised me was to be kind, was to be empathetic, was to be compassionate, and was to stand up to injustice. That is how they raised me. In my opinion, they raised me with dang good like morals and values. And I'm worried they're going to flip that. And so that shame is such a big part of keeping people oppressed. And I'm curious if shame and like society and community kind of banded together in your experiences to kind of be like, no. And it sounds like Sid, it kind of did for you, at least in the school experiences, but I'm curious for like, even with like home life, stuff like that, if there was that component of, I'm really worried that I'm going to do something that hurts either my loved ones or the people I know.
So it's really interesting that all of our lives have Christianity as like a common thread. As I said earlier, you know, we embraced Christianity when I was 10, and Christianity had a very pivotal role in the way that it, you know, exacerbated my feelings of what was and what wasn't acceptable. The Bible said that even having lustful thoughts was comparable to having actually committed the sexual act. So I was constantly forcing myself not to think of boys in my mind, in my head, and was failing miserably. And I would get out of the house determined, and then I would not look at boys who I found cute or think of them in desiring ways, and I would fail, and I'd come back, you know, and pray and repent and ask for forgiveness from God for having gone through that. And it was such a daily affair. I tried to fast and pray. Some of my fasts were like 7 days without water and food, and sometimes 21 days without food, but just water. And in hopes of changing. And interesting that I even went to Christian meetings, from meeting to meeting, hoping that a preacher would lay their hands on me and, you know, cast out the demon from me, demon of homosexuality. And so it was just this constant struggle that I even found myself attempting suicide so many times, and which, you know, people don't talk about it, but I guess we need to, because it's a reality of things. And I remember there were where I did my university in India, there were cliffs nearby, and I would quite often call my mom apologizing for you know, ending my life, and she would slowly and patiently try to talk me out of it, you know, but Yeah, I mean, I've never really spoken about these things before in my life, and it's just, I guess it has to be spoken about. And like you said, Justina, it's not easy because you know that your parents are, going to be affected by it in some way or the other, because our society in Kerala is very driven by image and status, so, and it's driven by shame, like all of you said, that there is this shame that gets attached to you, to the family, for the rest of your life, So it is quite hard. But fast forward, I moved to Sweden, and I decided to marry my best friend, who lived in the UK, and her husband had passed away, and leaving her with two very young kids. And I thought, yes, this is my way out of my homosexuality. And she knew I was gay, and we both believed that things would change and we could just take a step of faith forward, and it didn't. But separating from her, we were married for 4 years. Separating from her actually was liberating, even though it was difficult during the time. And it was, parallel to that, I also weaned myself away from Christianity, which kind of opened up possibilities for me to explore my sexuality more. And that is how I met my partner, Jason, and we've been married for 4 years now. So, yeah.
I think what's heartbreaking is how much damage those internalized messages cause. And I really appreciate you sharing the suicidal ideation piece, because that rings true for me as well. And the only thing that really kept me safe was thinking of my parents. They were the only, oh my God, sorry. They were the only reason that there were times where I was so close to the edge and I was like, nope, pull back. You have to do this for them. They love you. And even knowing that they loved me, even knowing that, I was so fearful of coming out to them, even knowing how liberal they were, how much they loved me, I was terrified, because you grow up hearing, no one will love you if you are gay. No one can accept you if you are gay. And I couldn't afford to lose my parents. I just couldn't. And so there are times you get really close to that edge and you're trying desperately to hang on for dear life. And you find those little things, and not everyone does. And it is important that we talk about it because of that, because those internalized messages do damage. They do such harm. And so like you, I ended up having to step away from the church because it was hurting me and I needed to heal. And so I walked back and I was like, no. And after this election, honestly, seeing how many Malayali Christians were on pulpits saying that we should vote for Trump after everything that he did to the queer community, after everything that administration did to dismantle our rights, it was honestly validation for leaving for me.
I also want to speak to the impact on mental health as well, because I think that there's so much stigma in talking about when you're in those darkest moments, both in the Black community, in the Christian community, in people that work in mental health, right? There's this belief that you have to have perfect mental health to help people with theirs, and that if you struggle with depression or anxiety, or in my case, I struggled with PTSD on and off for years, and that's never something that I feel like I can talk about. And that PTSD was rooted in a lot of things that happened all at once. But I just remember my heart feeling so tight all the time. And I know that biologically that makes no sense, but there was just this tension in my chest for years after I fell in love with a woman and then walked away from that and literally ran across the country. Askari can speak to this. After that and some other traumatizing events that happened that same year, I literally moved from Alabama to Boston. And people always wondered like, oh, why'd you move so far? And I said, oh, I didn't care where I went. I was running from myself, and I was running from the things that happened to me. And I was running from my fears of not being normal enough and not being okay enough. And part of the reason that I didn't go to graduate school right out of undergrad was because I knew that the way that my mental health was and the way I viewed my life as being optional, as being expendable, as being something that people wouldn't miss. I wasn't ready to go to grad school to be a psychologist. I was not. And I'm really, really pleased to say that a lot of therapy and a lot of, and my therapists, like we worked through my sexuality, we worked through my traumas, we worked through my depression, to the point where I felt like, okay, I'm ready to go help people. I'm ready to sort of be able to manage my own struggles. But up until that point, that fight was so fierce within myself. I was fighting me. And I don't think I've talked a lot about the impact of that particular conversation I mentioned with my family. And I too was heavily in the church. I was in the Auburn Christian Fellowship. I was a student leader. And I would, I know, Askari, you look shocked. I was, for my whole first year of undergrad, a student leader in one of the Christian fellowships on campus. And then I started hearing things that they would say about queer folks, about LGBTQ folks, about Black folks when they didn't think we were around. And I too walked away. I said, I can't do this. And at the time I thought I was offended because I was an ally, not because I was bisexual, but I was like, as an ally to the queer community, I can't stand for this, But I mean, how many of our queer brothers and sisters aren't here today to even have the option to do a panel like this because they took their lives? And I think about that often. I think about how we lose so many because of what this society tells us about what it is to be queer, to be gay, to be bi, to be pan, to be, trans, to be different. And I just really wanted to, I just really wanted to sort of speak to what Sid and Justina both said, that I don't think many of us are immune from those fights. And you're not supposed to talk about it. It's just one more thing we're not supposed to talk about. So yeah, me too, guys.
First, I just want to say thank y'all so much for sharing such intimate details. I mean, these are things that people in our community go through, specifically talking about the queer community, that it takes a lot of courage to bring up, and it can be really re-traumatizing. And here y'all are sharing these stories at the hope that we can provide education to those who might not be a part of the community or want to understand better. And so thank you. I was like, okay, I'm not going to cry. I'm not going to ruin my foundation. These are really hard things to talk about. And thank y'all so much for sharing. I feel like I am learning so much about y'all. And even though I've known Adrianna for almost, wow.
If you say how long we've known each other, no, see, now you're like drawing attention to my age. And I'm like, almost, don't do this. Don't do this to me.
This is why I love our community so much. There's just so much knowledge. And even though me and Sid, we're not even that far apart in age, but just those 2-3 years, you had so much more life experience. And when I feel like you're part of the queer community, every year that you make it to the next year, you just learn so much more about yourself. You gain so much richness of being in this community because you're denied that part of yourself for so many years, especially when you're a queer person of color who grew up in the church. Because I think I was just very fortunate that my dad was atheist, because I saw him and he just kind of did whatever he wanted and was like, all that matters is being a good person. And I thought, what a liberating thought to just think that there isn't some higher power that you have to constantly check yourself, whether, oh, I ate that piece of candy. Was that something I should or shouldn't have done? Just the tiniest things, the tiniest things that make you think, am I going to go to hell for this? Or is this going to get me further into heaven? So I think I was just really, really fortunate in having a dad who did that. And he really promoted a lot of independence and free thought. And from a very young age, I was doing things I did dance troupe. There were no other guys in dance troupe, but I really wanted a lollipop. That was what you got at the end of the semester for being in dance troupe. And he was like, you want a lollipop? Go be in dance troupe. And he really supported me in a lot of that. And so I think because of that contrasting narrative I was getting from him versus what I was getting from the church, I was always thinking to myself, yeah, I could do this being like, get further into Christianity. But I also could get that lollipop. I could go after that thing that I wanted to do and know that was not an innuendo, but the idea of just, I can go and I can do this thing that I want to do because I just want to do it. And if I want to do it, I have to make it happen. And my dad, bless him, he was not about to be like, I'm going to make all these pathways open for you. If you want to study abroad, if you want to do this, you got to make it happen. You got to come to me and prove why it should happen. So I think he was a really grounding force. But when you're a person of color anywhere in the world, there's this extra layer of everything I do is going to be scrutinized and come back on my family, my people, how I'm viewed. I'm leaving this job. I'm the second Black man I think that's been in this office in 5 years. I'm leaving in under a year. Are they ever going to hire another Black man again? This is Mississippi. I have no idea. They went 70% for Trump. That says a lot about the state of Mississippi. And so it's not just, it's like being queer is just another layer, like you said earlier, Justina, of feeling othered, of feeling like, how is what I do going to reflect upon my family? What is their status going to be? How are people going to view me? How are people going to view me outside of my community for the next 5, 10, 15 years? We already have to work 85 million times as hard to feel like to take one step forward in this society. And so a lot of thinking about Christianity, I think about it a lot of how it's rooted in whiteness. Even though it came from the Middle East, people of color, I feel like white people have really co-opted Christianity. And a lot of these ideas around homosexuality didn't exist in a lot of other cultures, except for Western Europe, that barren wasteland of no natural resources. And so they had to go everywhere else to find richness, culture, flavor. There's a lot of reasons why they don't flavor their food. Sorry, I'm about to get on my rant about whiteness. Let me calm down. But I mean, white people have destroyed this world in so many ways, from making us feel inferior because of the color of our skin to making us feel inferior because of our sexuality. When, like you said, Justine, we're born this way. No one should feel as if they matter less because of something that a book written 35,000, I don't know, time is not my greatest asset, but like centuries ago, like no one should feel less than because of religion. And I mean, if people actually read the New Testament, Jesus said love everyone. So where are these ideas of that people who are not straight, that the queer community doesn't matter, that they're not valid? And why don't we talk about mental health in our communities? I went to go to a therapist and I told my mom, I'm going to see therapy because I just don't know what I want to do. And her first thought was, well, have you prayed? Yes. And God said, meet me halfway. And me meeting him halfway was doing what I needed to do to take care of my mental health. Why don't we talk about the fact that God said, God bless a child that has their own. And sometimes finding your own is going out and finding resources to make yourself feel better so you can feel like you belong. So why aren't we having these conversations? There's so much stigma because in the Black community, I can speak for, if you do not come across as perfect, white people will think less of you. And if you come across as perfect, you're the exception. And I'm tired of us having to feel like we also have to pander to white people. But as this election has shown, you can't do that anymore because they don't care about you. More white women voted for Trump in this election than in the last one. They have 4 years to see how stupid he was. Had to catch myself. I'm going to use some words that were inappropriate. I'm sorry. Let me stop because now I'm starting to get angry. But thank you so much for sharing. And yeah, like I feel like whiteness, who has also co-opted even queerness in a way, is the root of a lot of our problems.
Oh, so I'm just going to say something real quick. Something
Okay.
I've noticed is that 3 of us so far have apologized for our emotions, and we should not be. Because it is not our fault that we feel the way we are feeling. Society has ingrained this trash in us. It has ingrained the anger, it has ingrained the fear and the sadness and the self-hatred. So we shouldn't be apologizing for feeling what we're feeling because it's truly not our fault. And a lot of the times we are told that it is. That's just all I wanted to say. Adrianna, go ahead.
Thank you for that addition. I think it's so important. I was just scolding a friend yesterday who apologizes 6.5 times per minute every time I have a meeting with her. And I was like, okay, but break from what we're doing. We need to talk about this. But that's not what I was. Askari, I just wanted to speak to like the belief, or like not even a belief, it's like a rule in the Black community. And I know it exists in other communities of color, but particularly in the Black community, you have to be so perfect. Any misstep, any mistake, any emotion that you have that does not fit within this box of what acceptable emotions are according to whiteness in particular, it's so damaging. I mean, I wasn't allowed to wear acrylics when I was growing up because my mom didn't want people to think of me as ghetto. I wasn't allowed to wear hoop earrings. If I bought them at the mall, they disappeared before the end of the week. You know what I mean? When I started to develop the Atlanta accent, I was told to drop it because it wasn't acceptable and I would never thrive at my white school if I sounded like other girls from my city. And now I'm kind of like, man, I wish I kind of sounded like I'm from where I'm from. I hate having this like Columbus, Ohio newscaster voice. It's not my favorite part of myself. You're laughing because you know it's true. Both of you know it's true. um, but I want to speak to what it does to you internally. I mean, every single misstep I would feel. I'm a naturally anxious person. I'm just very conscientious. I came out like that. Blame it on the fact that my mom was pregnant in medical school and the cortisol just baked me. The stress hormones just entered my spirit as I was developing. And what that does when you already might have tendencies to be perfectionistic, conscientious, anxious, whatever you want to call it, is it just like the physicality of it, like what it does to the body, is so powerful and permanent. I still have problems with my back because I feel like I was like this until I turned 22 or something like that. And I just remember I had a job before graduate school and I was being evaluated every week, and that was really stressful for me. And I just remember when the manager of this all-white female department, right, and they had me take the Myers-Briggs, and then I had a very different one than everyone else, and then the next week they told me it wasn't working out, but that's a whole other thing. And at the same time, I lost a family member, and my grief was not quiet. My grief was me crying in the office. My grief was me not talking to anyone. My grief was very human and loud. And a week later, I'm told, well, it's not working out. And I burst into tears and they say, you're just so hard on yourself. And I was like surrounded by this group of 7 white women and thinking, you all have no idea how much of a survival mechanism it is to be this perfectionistic, to be this hard on myself. And it's taken until probably the last 2 years of my life to unwind that. And I don't blame my family for communicating that message because both of my parents are physicians and there is no way they would have made it through medical school alive without having implemented those same types of restraints on the way they present themselves. And so they were like, if my daughter is going to survive 12 years at this white private school and go to grad school herself, we have to build this into her. And so I don't resent them at all for it because it did allow me to get to where I am. And finally, I'm in the place, you know, I'm getting to the end of my PhD journey, and I feel like I'm finally like, it's okay to live loud, right? And not be afraid that Black women are seen as loud and angry and this, that, and the third. That's just me. Y'all gonna get what you get. Because what I found was in that workplace I was in, I was quiet. I put myself in a box. I didn't wear my acrylics. I didn't wear my hoops. I dressed like everybody else, and I tried to fit in and tried to make myself fit. And it still didn't matter. They still saw me as too loud. They still saw me as too passionate. They still saw me as angry and unacceptable and not fitting. And I really want to talk about that as related to race because like you actually can't detangle oppressed identities at all. And it was also a very straight environment. And when I think about like the heteropatriarchy and white supremacy and colonialism, it's all so folded in on itself. And so I don't think that probably until this year, as I've been doing a lot of journaling during COVID, that I've ever sort of realized that being hard on myself also contributed to me bearing my sexuality because I didn't want that to be the thing. I considered that one of the ways in which I needed to be perfect as a Black woman was to be a straight Black woman. And so I think so much of the burying of my sexuality until I was in my early 20s was due to what Askari was talking about, which is you have to be perfect as a Black person in this country. And so honestly, Askari, until you were just talking about it, I don't think that I'd really, really put 2 and 2 together, that part of my burying it for so long was my desire to be that perfect Black woman. And my thing is like, Michelle Obama is a perfect Black woman and they still came for her and said all kind of horrible stuff. So if she can't skate through, I'm not going to skate through. So I'm not going to force myself into a little origami shape to make it happen. It's not going to happen. So anyway, that was very rambling and like went in a lot of directions. So thank you all for hanging in there with me as I process my emotions live on camera.
So far we've talked a lot about like the pain and the fear and the shame, I want to make sure we also cover the joy and the liberation and the self-love, because so often, especially in media, what you see is that pain. You don't get to see the joy, and you don't get to see people thriving. All you see is surviving. And so could you all kind of just touch on that a little bit?
I'll start because I just did something really heavy and dark, and so I'm gonna correct for it, and then I'll let everybody else go. I just really, really love this. So I remember the first time I was in a class or an event on campus, and I said I identify as a queer woman of color instead of just saying a woman of color. I feel like that was the turning point. I feel like everything professionally in my life just started working out, and I know that that's my imagination, but I think that's so important. Is that in my mind, I'm able to look at that moment, that day that I decided to just say I'm a queer woman of color. And when I look back on my career, it seems like everything after that really opened up. Whether or not that's the truth or not, the fact that I get to have that memory and have that belief and think maybe that's what it was is so cool. And doing that also allowed me to realize that other people around me were queer. Justina, I don't know how we found out we each other were, but whatever that moment is, it was probably something like that. It was probably
100%.
yeah.
It was literally, we were like sitting in our 116U lab, and we were just talking. And so our program is very white, very straight, very female. And so I was like, it's just rough sometimes being a queer woman of color because I identify as bisexual. And Adrianna, you literally just went, me too. And I was like, oh, because I was so used to being alone that I was like, oh my God.
Yes. And then because we both had talked about it, then another student in our program came to us like a year later and was like, so I'm queer and I don't know what to do. And we were both like, sis, same. And she was like, what? And she started crying harder. Like those moments where you connect with people, even if it's over a hard situation, that feeling of community, that feeling of just grasping someone's hand so tight and not wanting to let go is like the emotional equivalent of how I have felt every time another queer person has come out to me or I've come out to them, and you just have this moment where you just see each other. And there's something about, like, I love the connections I have with the fellow Black women in my life, but there's something about the queer folks I know, because you do have to like tell someone about it, right? You have to like, there's like this, I don't know the noun form of to divulge, but you're divulging, so maybe it's just whatever. You're divulging this piece of yourself and it feels so vulnerable and you might be afraid of blowback in that moment where they're like, oh girl, same. Or like, oh my God, you too? Like, let's go to Pride together. And there's just something precious about it, something precious about the bonds that you build in the queer community that is really hard to describe. Anyway, yeah.
I know for me, like, I used to love the phrase like blood is thicker than water, but people tend to get it wrong. It's the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. And what I love so much about being part of this community is that I get to make my own family. There's a show on Netflix called Pose, which is incredible. And seeing just like, the representation, queer people of color, trans people of color, people having happy stories, people having sad stories, like people just living life. I mean, seeing that was just really empowering. Definitely give it a watch. 2 seasons, 10 episodes per season. I was sobbing and laughing and cheering the entire like 20 hours I was watching it. But just knowing that I honestly feel bad sometimes for like straight cis men, because they're always having to wonder if their actions are perceived in a certain way. And they always have to wonder like, man, umbrellas are gay. What? Being wet from the rain is gay? You have problems. Like, that sucks that you have to think about that. I'm going to use this umbrella happily and stay dry because I'm wearing my fabulous cashmere sweater, my amazing shoes that were like handcrafted in Italy, and I look good. My clothes are going to stay good. Like, I feel very free in expressing like my more feminine side, my more masculine side. Like, I get to just be me. I don't have to wonder how's that perceived. Like, okay, you think I'm gay? Whatever. But guess what? I'm happy. I get to go out and express myself how I want to, and people, there's such a range of just colors and emotions and fun and joy that you get to see in the queer community that, I mean, I feel bad. Like, they're mad at us because they can't be us. They want to experience that joy, that celebration. Sorry, like, being straight, like, if that's for you, sure, but I'm gonna live my colorful life and it's fun over here. Like, we have cookies. What do y'all have? Like, hammers and shop class? Great, build me a birdhouse, but I'm gonna be colorful like the birds. So just look on as I like trail on and on, the rainbow follows me. Like, it's just fun. It's just honestly fun.
I think
I love
that's,
all of that.
yeah,
Sorry,
it's
that was just
beautiful.
amazing.
But that just so speaks to like how homophobia and transphobia doesn't just harm queer folk, it harms straight folk too. Because do y'all remember when no homo was a thing? Like men couldn't even compliment each other without being able to say, but no homo. And it's just wild. You can't express affection for someone you care about without the worry of being perceived as gay. And that's just heartbreaking. You should be allowed to make those connections. You should be able to have that community that we have, where we feel comfortable complimenting each other, where we feel comfortable expressing love for each other.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that, Justina, that freedom to express ourselves is something that queerness has made possible, not just in terms of sexuality, but in our entire life becomes so queer, so liberating, and so many possibilities. But I like what all of you spoke about Pose, which is amazing, and you know, the sort of connections with the queer POC family. That sort of, I like the word kinship, because it's stronger than family bonds, like, you know, what you said, Askari. There's that element of deep care, empathy, a connection that goes deeper in terms of there's a collective suffering that's there, but there's also collective liberation that comes with that sort of connection. So yeah, I'm hugely for the idea of kinship, much more than the idea of allyship, because I feel kinship is way more stronger, because you feel each other's sort of affect and emotions way more. Yeah.
That is the perfect segue into allyship and kinship. And what do you want to see from folks who are trying to be allies, who are trying to be kin with the queer community?
No, you go, Adrianna.
Okay. I'm going to answer this by describing what my allies have meant to me and what they have done that has been so amazing. I remember I didn't come out first to my best friend on earth. I came out to all my queer and gay friends first, and like my gay relatives first. And I was afraid that, like, her being a straight cis woman, that we have a very close bond, maybe a little too close, and I was afraid that she would think that I had feelings for her, or that it would change our friendship. And when I told her that, she was like, "You are so smart, but that was so dumb. That is the dumbest thing I've ever." She just, like, gay people aren't trying to get with you. Like, when they come out, they're not confessing their love for you. You know, I feel like a lot of people, like, growing up, like, men were like, "Oh, I don't want gay men hitting on me." You know, that kind of thing. Like, that assumption is so whack. Don't do that. Just, like, and if you feel like you have those fears within yourself, do some work to, like, get that out of your system. Because I promise you that me coming out to you has nothing to do with you and has more to do with me. Like, stop centering yourself in my narrative. You know what I mean? But just that unconditional love that you have for your friends anyway, that you have for your loved ones anyway, like, don't let it change. Like, I remember she was like, "Why would this change our friendship?" And then it didn't. Our friendship is exactly the same, if not closer, because, you know, we once I came out to her, I just noticed, like, there were conversations we had where she was more comfortable talking about other things, you know, like, just things that, I mean, for example, talking about sex. Like, I've always been a very sex positive person. I think that's really important, especially, like, I do a lot of work with adolescents, and there's so much confusion tied up in that. And so, like, it helps my work that I do not feel squeamish, confused, or shame when talking about sex. And even though, like, sexuality and, like, sexual identity, like, don't need to be interlaced, I just felt like this is a person who their sort of beliefs about their own sort of sexuality and that aspect of themselves was also heavily impacted by the church, and she had never felt comfortable talking to anyone about those things. And so I don't want to conflate sexuality and sexual identity, but I do feel like once I came out to her, like, she felt really comfortable being vulnerable, authentic with me. And so that's what I like to see from the community is honoring my vulnerability, is loving me just like you did beforehand, is speaking up for me and my community when people are talking trash. Like I love when I see people going to bat in the comments. They're like, I know somebody who's queer and da 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 da, and I'm like, oh, that could be me. They could be talking about me. And so just like fighting for me in the same way that you're hashtagging Black Lives Matter and putting up a little useless black square on your Instagram because you didn't realize it was problematic till it was over. Do the same thing for my queer identity. If you're going to stick up for one area of my marginalization, why not also my sexual identity, right? And that's part of, I think, why we're even having this conversation today is like, you know, oh, what are the letters? Malayalis for Black Lives Matter. It's a lot of letters, but this organization for which we're doing this panel for, right? It's for Black lives, but it's not just about Blackness. It's about folks like me and Askari who are queer Black folks. And so, yeah, holistic support. MBLM. Thank you, Justina.
Sorry, I just like was about to speak and you said that I just had to crack up. I'm gonna say like my advice might come across a little abrasive, but sometimes like shut the hell up, step back, don't center yourself. Like Adrianna said, if someone's coming out to you, be silent. It's taking a lot of courage and bravery for them to even talk about this part of their identity, that they can be marginalized in so many ways, but for some reason queerness is such a special form of marginalization that it takes a lot of courage to come out because it's so hidden. Even when it's not hidden, it's still hidden. So when they're coming out, like if they're pausing, like give them the space to pause. Just sit there, be reassuring, smile, like look at them kindly, be there, but just don't interrupt. And then when it, like Adrianna said, like speak out about it. And also don't assume that now that they're queer, because they're talking about queerness, that's not their identity. That's not just their only part of their identity. Being gay, yes, it's a part of me, but that's not the only part of me. You knew me before you knew I was queer. You're gonna know me after I'm queer. But a lot of queer people don't have the space to just be queer. They don't get to talk about their crushes. They don't get to express interest in other people openly and have those conversations until they either find other queer people, which can feel impossible sometimes, or you're their friend like, oh, I really want to talk about how I'm interested in this guy or this girl or this person. But you say you're cool, but let them have that space. Encourage those kind of conversations because they listen to you talk about your crushes for the past 10 years. So now it's your time to listen to them. And if you feel uncomfortable, that's some self-reflection for you to do, not for them to do. Because them being queer is not the only way to describe them. And also don't introduce them saying, this is my queer friend. Don't say, oh, I know this other queer person that you might be interested in. Being queer is a part of me. It is not just the only part of who I am. You wouldn't say, I have another Black friend. I have another Malayalee friend. You wouldn't say, I have another friend who's also Christian. You should date them. So if you wouldn't do that, don't do that about being queer. It might have come across a little abrasive, but you know, as Adrianna could tell you, I'm a very blunt person, but also keep being awesome. Just show love and support. And if you do that, you're going to be doing the right thing.
I totally agree with Adrianna and Askari about not centering yourself in the conversation. But another aspect that I feel strongly about is being curious. I like that the word curious has the root meaning care. So if you're really, really, really caring for us, you'd be curious and suspend your beliefs and preconceived notions and imagery and listen to stories of queer folks. And I think listening to stories are perhaps the key ways into the queer world. So yeah, into all the richness and diversity.
So I echo all of that. I think the only thing I would add is if we say something happened and it is homophobic, believe us. Do not try to undermine us. Do not try to gaslight us. Believe what we're saying because we are the ones experiencing it. It's the same stuff that we have to do with Black folk when we're allying with them. Believe their stories. Same thing we have to do with women when we're allying with them. Believe their stories. Yeah, I think that's a big thing because so often we are just told like, that can't be real. That's not really happening to you.
Can I build off of that, Justina? I'd really like to. Oh, Sid, you unmuted. Do you want to? Oh, okay. I just want to add that, like, so the gaslighting, the not believing, but also don't point out what they might have meant. Because when it comes to experiences with oppression, and everyone in this community knows, like when you experience racism, right, it doesn't always matter what the person meant. It's the impact on you. That's what ends up mattering. That's what ends up being salient. The same goes for queer folks. So if something happened, you go, oh, well, they probably didn't mean it. That doesn't help me right now. I'm telling you because my feelings are hurt, not because I'm trying to have, maybe later on I can get to the point where I have compassion for this person. But I know for me, at least, when I'm telling someone something homophobic happened or something racist happened or something sexist happened, and I'm telling a friend or an ally, I just need support in that moment. We can talk about having empathy and compassion and understanding for the person who hurt me later. So I would just add that. So do you have something?
I just wanted to add that tone policing is quite prominent in the queer and trans community as well. White folks, tone policing queer, Black, and Indigenous, and people of color. So I think that's perhaps another aspect to consider when being allies, to not speak about intentions, but consider, like Adrianna, what you said about the impact and how it affects queer, Black, and people of color.
So for our audience who may not know, what do you mean specifically when you say tone policing? Because most of the time when we think tone policing, we're thinking more the racial side of things. And so can you give like an example of what that would look like?
Like queer folks and white queer folks talking about aspects that affect Black and Indigenous people. And when we raise our concerns about how that affects us, being not listening to the message, but focusing on the tone when the tone may have been totally fine. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and also sometimes the tone isn't fine because what happened is not fine, and that is also okay if you are feeling that way. And don't tone police, even if we aren't fine and we're getting angry. Don't invalidate us by being like, oh, you're being emotional. That's not okay. Because of course we're being emotional, we're being hurt. Is there anything else people would like to add about the allyship, kinship piece?
I really liked how you said like curiosity is the root is care. Like ask questions and really ask questions with caring, because Google is your friend. There are going to be times where you're going to want to know something and just don't ask the person. Like if you wouldn't want to be asked that question, like there are questions that you just don't ask people who might be transitioning, because guess what? It's really not your business and it shouldn't matter. There are questions you want to know about what goes on in my bedroom. I don't know what goes on in yours, so please don't ask what goes on in mine. Now, if we're really, really close and we've had conversations, that's one thing. But if I'm just coming out to you, please don't ask those questions. But also, just like you want to know, a lot of times people coming out to you, they are also finding out who they are. They're learning a lot about queerness at the same time. So they might not have the language to talk about it. They may not even know themselves. And by asking certain types of questions, you could be actually pushing them away from queerness again. And they're just getting to learn to love and accept themselves. So please, when you're asking questions, like, yes, be curious, but ask those questions with care. Just how you want someone to talk to you, please talk to people who might be coming out and people in this community that same way.
So in sum, treat us like human. Yeah, is that it? All right, so we are almost out of time, so I want to ask our final question before we sign off for the day. If people could take away one thing from this conversation, what would you like for them to take away?
I know you said one thing, but can I do two things? Okay. So one, I really want people to realize that this is something you're born with, and I couldn't change my sexuality any more than I could change my race, that I could change my hair texture, that I could change the shape of my nose. And would you condemn a loved one in your life for being born with the hair texture they have, for their facial features, for their height? If no, don't condemn me for loving who I love. Because trust me, I already tried to do it and it's not helpful. And then the second thing is, I think so many people of color can relate to experiences of oppression with race specifically. And if you're having trouble understanding what oppression due to sexual identity might feel like, just remember that like that feeling of oppression, like they're more similar than they are different. And so if you're struggling to find empathy for someone, tap into similar experiences that you've had with oppression. Be it for your race or your religion or things like that. And so if you're having trouble figuring out how to empathize, remember that you've probably had a similar experience at some point in your life that you could tap into to understand. Those are my two things.
Mine would be, even if you don't consider yourself part of the community, your love and support matters. If someone's coming out to you, it's because they value you as a person and they want you to be able to share 100% in who they are authentically. And so know that someone coming out to you isn't about you. It's about them wanting to include you fully in their life. And they want to be able to share parts of you that they might feel they've had to keep hidden. So your love and support really, really matters. And every time someone comes out to you, it's them saying they care about you so much and they love and want you in their life so badly that they're willing to risk potential harm because that's how much you matter to them. So remember, like, your love and support is so important. So please, please, please be there for them.
I would like to highlight the fact that listening to the community is probably the most important, and amplifying voices of people of color within the community particularly. Yeah, those two things.
So my final takeaway is for our queer siblings. I want you to know you are worthy of dignity. You are worthy of love. You are worthy of more than tolerance. You are worthy of radical, open-armed acceptance. And you deserve more than you have been given in this world. But know that we are a community that is here. And I mean, you are who you are, and we love you for that. So thank you all for this wonderful conversation. I've really enjoyed talking with you about this, and I really hope for our audience this helps to make a positive impact, both for our queer community and for our folk who are trying to ally themselves with us.